development to it. And please stick with me because it's going to take me a minute or two to lay this one out. I want to start with the new reporting. This from CNN. Headline: New Mexico authorities search Zorro Ranch, formerly owned by Epstein. And that article begins: authorities in New Mexico launched a search this week of a sprawling ranch formerly owned by convicted sex offender Jeffrey Epstein, which has come under renewed interest after allegations surrounding the estate were included in files recently released by the U.S. Justice Department. The New Mexico Department of Justice announced the Monday morning search of the property known as Zorro Ranch in a brief statement posted to its website. It's part of the criminal investigation announced by state authorities, New Mexico state authorities, last month into allegations of illegal activity surrounding the ranch at the time Epstein, who died in 2019, owned it. The ranch had previously not been subject to the same level of law enforcement scrutiny as Epstein's other properties in New York, South Florida, and the Caribbean, but following the release of troves of federal government files related to Epstein, New Mexico Attorney General Raul Torres ordered the reopening of the state's criminal investigation into that property, which he said closed in 2019 at the request of federal prosecutors. Wait, what? And you might actually hear the thunder clapping overhead. There is a thunderstorm passing over my studio at this moment. And that was one heck of a revelation. There was a state law enforcement investigation into Jeffrey Epstein and his alleged crimes at the Zorro Ranch in New Mexico, but the feds shut it down in 2019. Donald Trump's Department of Justice shut it down in 2019? Okay, well, wait a minute. This was reported by CNN, so, maybe there will be an allegation that this is fake news. Well, here is what Republican James Comer, the chairman of the House Committee on Oversight and Accountability investigating the Epstein files, just had to say to Fox News.
Sounds pretty sick if what's been said about it's true. What are you hearing?
Well, I'm glad that the New Mexico authorities are going there and searching that property. I know that if no one searches the property, whenever this investigation is finally concluded, people are always going to have questions about whether or not there were deaths there, whether or not there were mysterious surgeries and things like that happening on the ranch. I don't know, but I do know this. The federal government asked New Mexico to stop their investigation, I believe back in 2019, of that ranch. So there's just so many questions about how the government failed the victims and how government failed in trying to prosecute Epstein sooner. I mean, this whole thing doesn't make sense.
That's right, friends. It looks like Donald Trump's Department of Justice in his first term in 2019 shut down a New Mexico state law enforcement investigation of Zorro Ranch and Epstein's crimes. Here's the new reporting from Newsweek. Headline: Trump DOJ pumped brakes on Jeffrey Epstein's ranch probe, says Republican. President Donald Trump's Justice Department told officials in New Mexico to halt a 2019 investigation into Jeffrey Epstein's former ranch, a senior Republican lawmaker said this week, raising fresh questions as the site is searched again. Okay, friends, before we discuss the takeaways from this dramatic new development in the Epstein files saga, I want to make sure we have the full context of what it means that Donald Trump's Department of Justice in 2019 shut down the New Mexico state investigation of Epstein's crimes at the Zorro Ranch. Here is an email recently released from the Epstein files that puts in context just how important it was to make sure there was a law enforcement investigation into what the heck happened at the Zorro Ranch. This from MS Now. It's an email from somebody named Eddie Aragon to a person whose name is redacted. Subject, forward, confidential, Jeffrey Epstein. Dated Monday, 25 November 2019. Importance, normal. Edward, this is sensitive, so it will be the first and last email depending on your discretion. You can choose to take it or trash it, but this comes from a person that has been there and seen it all as a former staff. The material below was taken from Jeffrey Epstein home as my insurance in case of future litigation against Epstein. Sorry, no questions. What is damning about Jeffrey Epstein is yet to be written. Did you know somewhere in the hills outside the Zorro, 2 foreign girls were buried on orders of Jeffrey and Madam G? Both died by strangulation. And then, friends, I'm not going to quote the rest for fear it might violate some YouTube guidelines, but suffice it to say it had something to do with Jeffrey Epstein's sex trafficking of girls. And then it says, here are the video footage of Jeffrey Epstein, and then there are multiple links, apparently, to video footage. And yet, friends, notwithstanding that information, let's go back to what the New York State Attorney General said. New Mexico Attorney General Raul Torres said the investigation was closed in 2019 at the request of federal prosecutors. And now, friends, let me answer one of the obvious questions. Who is Eddie Aragon? The CNN reporting has some information about that. Eddie Aragon is a local radio host, and he told CNN that he believed the email was sent to him by someone who worked on the Zorro Ranch, but wouldn't disclose who he thought the person was. The radio host added that he went to the local FBI office with the email and forwarded it to a local FBI agent. Following the recent reopening of the state investigation, Aragon told CNN on Tuesday that he reached out to the New Mexico Department of Justice and had an approximately 30-minute interview. Okay, friends, a few takeaways. New Mexico law enforcement authorities were investigating Jeffrey Epstein and his Zorro Ranch back in 2019. But Donald Trump's Department of Justice, headed up by who at the time? Attorney General Bill Barr, shut down the New Mexico State investigation. Why? Oh, and I suspect we will learn why. But why? Was it to protect someone, Jeffrey Epstein, Donald Trump, someone else? And why would they search his New York home, Epstein's New York home, his Florida home, his Caribbean home, but not search his home, his ranch in New Mexico, particularly when there was information that had been provided back in 2019 about 2 girls being murdered and buried on his property? 2 more things, friends. First of all, I was a federal prosecutor for decades. It's not unusual for the federal government, the Department of Justice, federal prosecutors to approach state law enforcement authorities, police and prosecutors, and say, we have a federal interest in investigating these suspected crimes, and we may want to take the lead prosecuting them. So can we ask you all to take a back seat to our federal investigation? Or maybe we would ask state authorities to conduct the investigation jointly. That is entirely usual when the rule of law is a thing that is respected by all, by state authorities and federal authorities. The rule of law is not a thing presently in Donald Trump and Pam Bondi's Department of Justice. But that's not unusual. The feds asking the states to stand down while we, the feds, conduct the investigation and the prosecution. But that is with a view toward the feds actually wanting to investigate and prosecute crimes, particularly, double homicides, where girls are buried on the potential defendant's property. But that doesn't seem to be what happened here, because it looks like the feds put a stop to a state investigation in New Mexico and did nothing, at least by outward appearances. One more thing. I am glad that the New Mexico law enforcement authorities are conducting searches of the Zorro Ranch virtually as we speak. Here's the thing. If those girls or if others were buried on Epstein's property, I've worked with cadaver dogs in some of the cases that I handled as a prosecutor. They are amazing. I mean, I could tell you stories and it would be hard to believe what cadaver dogs are able to find even when years or decades have gone by, even when we've had instances where bodies were encased in concrete and buried 40 feet down, underground, and the dogs could still detect years later that there were human remains down there. It really is amazing what they can do. And so I am hopeful that they're running cadaver dogs all over Epstein's former ranch and that they will find what needs to be found. But what we need to find are answers to why Donald Trump's Department of Justice shut down the state investigation into Epstein's Zorro Ranch. We need those answers. I am beginning to believe there's no stopping the Epstein files train from continuing to roll down the track until we have full transparency. Because more than anything, the victims of Epstein's crimes, the survivors of Epstein's crimes, and those who didn't survive, they need answers and they need justice. Because justice matters. Friends, as always, please stay safe. Please stay tuned. And I look forward to talking with you all again tomorrow.
Since we're waiting for a quorum and since we're considering U.S. attorneys today, I wanted to draw a little bit of attention to the situation with the U.S. attorneys in Missouri and in Georgia with respect to the affidavit that supported the search and seizure of the Fulton County election records. Having been a U.S. attorney, the way that this ordinarily works is that if you have a multi-state investigation, the U.S. attorney who is running the investigation brings in the U.S. attorney for a state in which material is sought, in which a search warrant is going to be executed. And that U.S. attorney goes to their local judge, gets the search warrant, and then the materials go to the U.S. attorney who's leading the investigation. In this case, the U.S. attorney from Missouri cut out the U.S. attorney from Georgia. So if this case were to go to trial or to be charged, the defendant would have some interesting questions about why the Department of Justice didn't follow regular procedure. If they pursued that, they'd find out that the U.S. attorney from Missouri who did this is riddled with election denial history from his previous career and is tied in with some of the worst election denial people in the administration who talked to him about this. So that opens a whole other avenue for a defendant, if charges are ever brought, to challenge what went on in that process. To make it worse, the local special agent in charge of the Atlanta field office was quit or was forced out just days before this search warrant, which is strongly suggestive that the local FBI office wanted no part of this and that he might even be objecting to it. Again, another avenue for a defendant to explore in the event that charges were ever brought. Then you get to the affidavit itself, which is weird in at least two respects. First, it left out a lot of information about the credibility of anonymous witnesses that were cited in the affidavit. There was enough information about those so-called anonymous witnesses that it's not that hard to figure out who they were. And once you know who they are, it's not hard to figure out that the affidavit left out significant information about their role in the election denial conspiracy in Georgia. Why would an FBI agent leave out that information that goes to the credibility of those witnesses? Again, if you have a defendant, that is a question the defendant gets to explore, and it's not going to make the search look good. Why open that avenue? Then the affidavit left an explicit out in which the agent said, maybe there's